Hi everyone. This video is about proper care and feeding of a turbocharged engine. And specifically, this is for my 2024 Ford Maverick EcoBoost. So there are three key things to be aware of when you are properly maintaining a turbocharged engine of any kind. And there are technically even more details to be aware of, but these three things will get you a long way, and then there's more to come from there, both with personal research or with, just looking through the manual, which is generally a very good idea to look through your owner's manual, read it over thoroughly. The more that you know, the better prepared you can be, and perhaps the longer your engine and vehicle will last overall. All right, so with that, the three categories I'm going to focus on today are number 1, oil, number 2, heat, and number 3, fuel. Now, it doesn't have to be in that particular order. Obviously, if there's an extreme in any one of those areas, then it can be catastrophic. But that's the order I'm going to include today. All right, first of all, with the oil, take a look at what is shown here. SAE 5W30. So the 5W30 motor oil is a heavier grade of oil or weight of oil than what would be recommended for a non-turbocharged engine. Now, be aware of that fact, because I have owned multiple turbocharged vehicles, and I've also owned multiple non-turbocharged vehicles. And when I had a 2016 Subaru Forester 2.0 XT turbo, and also when I had a 2010 Mitsubishi Lancer Rally Art with a turbocharged engine, in both of those cases, when I took it into the dealer, there were discrepancies about what oil it should have, and in one, if not both of those vehicles, the dealer put in the lighter weight oil for the more mainstream, commonplace, non-turbocharged versions of those vehicles. And that is a very bad thing that can happen. Now, thankfully, I was not driving a lot of miles at that time, and for the most part, I was not driving those vehicles in very warm conditions. I wasn't driving them extremely hard, at least the majority of the time. But it can have an effect on your turbocharger, because you need the oil not only for lubrication, which is the obvious, but oil is also a huge factor in the cooling of an engine, and especially a turbocharger. A turbocharger is going to be getting some of the highest hot points out of the entire engine and related components, because it is connected to the exhaust, obviously, for how the turbocharger works. Now, speaking of a hot turbocharger, that leads me to the next piece, which is turbocharger heating. Now, you can't really see it from this video, especially with my lighting, but please bear with me. If you look at the intake hose and you follow that along, here, let me start at the air filter. If you go from the air filter here, you follow the intake hose from the air box of the air filter down toward the firewall, whether it's, in this case, a Maverick EcoBoost or another turbocharged engine. If you follow that air path and you look for a lot of heat shielding, you can generally see where the turbocharger is. Now, you can't really see it from this video, but just know that the turbocharger, so to speak, lives near the exhaust ports of most engines. So that being the case, it's going to be very hot. Again, quick tie back to The oil, if you have oil that's too thin, your turbocharger can burn it off too easily. And not only that, but it can not properly dissipate the heat for that turbocharger. So oil is crucial. Making sure you're changing your oil at least as often as the manual recommends, if not more often. Making certain that you use the right viscosity, which is going to be shown in your owner's manual. And in this case, as in many cases of vehicles, it'll show right on the cap for the oil filler tube as well. All right, so coming back to the topic of heat. So if you have driven your vehicle a long distance or up hilly terrain or towing or on a really hot day, any of those things, your turbocharger can be very hot. And the more extreme the situation, the hotter the ambient air temperature, the harder you've driven, the more strain you put on the vehicle for towing or hilly terrain, etc., the longer you need to let your engine cool off before you turn off the engine completely. Now you may be saying, well, wait a second, what about start-stop? The Maverick EcoBoost has start-stop, and some people find that very annoying. Well, thankfully, the designers of modern engines that have the start-stop technology have placed within the computer controls essentially a function that monitors engine temperature and a variety of other parameters, so that if the engine is too hot or too cold or the battery is too weak, etc., the start-stop will not function. At least in this case with the Maverick, I have noticed those sorts of things. Also, when the engine does go into the stop mode, but the ignition is still turned on, there are recirculation pumps that keep the oil circulating so that you're not just baking your oil in your turbocharger, which can be detrimental in more ways than one. Now, it could be debated that it's still better to leave the engine completely running. However, if you're doing that, you're pumping more exhaust heat into the turbocharger, and you don't have the airflow of motion from driving the vehicle on the roadway. So there is some give and take, but that's just something to be aware of. Again, when you've driven a vehicle hard in any way, make sure that you wait a while before you turn the ignition completely off. What I tend to see and hear most commonly is give it about 1 minute of essentially idling before you turn it off. Now for me, it's nice because where I park each day at work, I have a certain routine where I generally will back into my parking spot, and I want to make sure that I am avoiding the island where there is all kinds of nice rose bushes, and then there's often other vehicles nearby and so forth. So I take my time getting situated, getting parked out of the way of the main traffic in the parking lot of my workplace. And so from the time that I pull into the parking lot until I am fully parked, and I'm kind of particular at exactly how I park, my coworkers could tell you, but in any case, I probably have my engine running about a full minute from the time I enter the parking lot at essentially an idle until I park. So that way it's great. In fact, once I fully park and I place the gear selector in park and put on the parking brake, I wait just a moment, make sure everything's settled. Again, I'm pretty particular about these things, but hey, maybe this makes my vehicle last 1% longer or 10% longer, who knows, or even just the turbocharger. But in any case, I let it sit for just a second or two after all of that, and then I turn it off. Anyhow, you get the idea. So I'm not saying everybody needs to be as particular as I am. However, if you have a turbocharged engine, the point is make sure that you let it idle for about a minute to circulate that hot oil away from the turbocharger if you've driven it hard, before you turn off the ignition completely, which then is ideally fully turning everything off as needed. Okay, well, we've covered oil, we've covered heat, like with the turbocharger. What's the third item? The third item is fuel. So let's go around to the back here where the fuel filler cap is, but that's not the focus of our attention. The focus is going to be on the Ford manual. 2024 Ford Maverick Owner's Manual. All right, let's take a look at what I have here. Now, from what I recall, I'm looking for page 174. Yes, here it is. Let's see what I have. Now, this may be contrary to what a lot of you have heard. It says for best overall vehicle and engine performance, best overall, premium fuel with an octane rating of 91 or higher is recommended. Wait a second. I thought my Maverick EcoBoost could run on regular. Well, it can. Notice here, your vehicle operates on regular unleaded gasoline with a minimum pump R+M octane rating of 87. And it goes on from there. So what's this conflict? The key is that this says it operates on regular unleaded gasoline. However, for best overall vehicle and engine performance, premium fuel with an octane rating of 91 or higher is recommended. The performance gained by using premium fuel is most noticeable in hot weather as well as other conditions, for example, when towing a trailer. Why hot weather? Well, when an engine and therefore the fuel and so forth is hotter, there is a greater chance of knock, which is talked about down below on this same page under the heading Fuel and Refueling. Your manual may be slightly different than this. Mine is page 174. In any case, the hotter the engine, the hotter the ambient air, the greater the chance of knocking, and therefore you would need a higher octane to avoid that knock. So I have never used any fuel less than 92 octane with my Maverick. Am I saying you have to do that? Not at all. However, if you want to get the best possible longevity, engine performance, and so forth, I would recommend sticking with premium unless you absolutely have to go with regular. Now, if you are in a cold season, so winter, or you're in an area that never sees very hot temperatures, relatively speaking, you might not see the need for it, and I can understand that. Perhaps maybe a mid-grade would be better. But when you have a turbocharged engine, turbochargers generally thrive best when you have higher octane so that the engine computer can properly control the timing and fuel ratio and all of those parameters. All right, so in summary, we talked about the oil, we talked about the heat, and we talked about the fuel. Those are the three key components to be aware of that might be different than a naturally aspirated engine. That if you have a turbocharged engine, you need to be aware of those things for proper care and feeding. All right, well, I want to give a shout out to Balding Buffalo for suggesting this video content today. And another great thank you to my neighbors, Kevin and Bailey. Thank you so much for cheering me on and encouraging me to keep up the good work. You all are awesome. And this is Jared with C.A.R.S. Have a great rest of your day.